Is Kachan okay? It was the first question Izuku had when he'd had enough consciousness to do so. The first several days had been a blur of the ceiling of a hospital he didn't recognize, fluorescent lights that hurt his eyes, and the deep, dull ache of physical pain, pulsing beneath the hazy veneer of whatever was pumping through his IV. Now, Izuku was finally partially sitting up in bed. Both of his legs, broken, were propped up on pillows, and he was glad they weren't lofted up in the air by the weird pulley system like in the beginning. His fractured collarbone had been set, his arm in a sling. His eyebrows were stitched shut, as well as the reopened wound at his hairline. Recovery Girl had later told him the eyebrow would scar, a vicious slash down through the corner near his temple. Izuku didn't see why that was necessary to say. He'd been covered in scars for years. One on his face made no difference to him. There was only one thing that mattered right now. Is he? Izuku said, looking between Ochako, Ida, and Todoroki with panic rising in his voice. What's the matter? He's fine, Todoroki said, his voice even, calming. He sat in a chair on one side of the bed, hands folded on his lap. He considered Izuku carefully, as if choosing his words. Mostly, his hands. I'm guessing you saw what happened, since you were the one to lead Crusher away. Crusher? The villain. We apprehended him shortly after saving you. He was harder to find. He was buried at the base of the mountain. You were near the top of the pile. Izuku's lips tightened and paled as he recalled. He'd never had to use 100% force through his feet. He'd reached the top and rocketed himself to the heavens, the energy from the jump jolting through the mountain and cracking it to the core, just as he'd planned. But he hadn't seen the outcome. Being at that altitude and driving himself even further into the thin air, Izuku had lost consciousness halfway up. He hadn't even felt the fall. He didn't think it was necessary to tell anyone about that, though. What was done was done. He held no regrets. How are his hands? Izuku said, shaking himself from his somewhat drug-induced wandering thoughts. Recovery Girl had said that there was barely enough solid, uncrushed pieces of bone to reform his hands, even with her advanced abilities. Todoroki said, hushed, as if this was something they didn't dare speak of. Kachan being weak. I guess she placed in some pins. She doesn't know how it'll affect his ability to use his quirk in the future, but at least he has hands. He's a fast healer, Izuku said with a weak curve of lips. He'll be okay. He's actually... Todoroki looked at Ida and Ochako across the bed, searching for something Izuku didn't understand. He's around here, Ochako said with a soft smile, her hands resting over Izuku's upon the sheets. Getting the cast off of his hands. Recovery Girl has some compression gloves for him to wear for a couple of weeks that'll aid in the healing process. He's here? Izuku's heart suddenly sped up, the monitor beside his bed fluttering and beeping to life. Swallowing hard, his cheeks heating as he looked between his friends, he forced himself to relax. Did he visit me? No. Todoroki glanced at Izuku, then back to Ida and Ochako. Bakugou, he was extremely passionate about your rescue, Ida said, his expression grave. I admit, I've never seen such an admirable side to him before. He was kept on sedation for the first day and night, not simply for the pain, but he kept trying to get to you. Todoroki said, his mouth quirking as he shook his head with a look of disbelief. I've never seen anything like it. He was fighting through the sedation. They had to give him 4 times the amount. Recovery Girl said it was enough for a 300-pound man. Izuku's heart monitor beeped anew. Kachan. Izuku said quietly, looking down at his crushed legs, his mouth a sober line.
We're not together, Deku.
Izuku's chest clenched. When we arrived at the scene, Todoroki continued, low and even, staring off into his recollection. He was like a wild animal, not the big dumb oaf who spouts threats and fire like usual. His hands were these crumpled, hanging things at his sides. His eyes were crazed, and he was just running right into the avalanche. He didn't care. Todoroki met Izuku's damp eyes then. His own held some kind of peace and acceptance. He didn't care about anything but getting to you. That's all he said. He needed to get to you. He would have buried himself for you just then. I saw that.
We did too,
Ochako said. She rubbed her lips together, her small hand squeezing Izuku's large one.
Listen, Deku, after that kind of scene, I think it was pretty obvious to everyone that there's something there going on between you.
Izuku's eyes went wide, his nervous glance tracking Todoroki's features. Todoroki shrugged. I didn't say a word. It was kind of obvious. In 3 years, no one has seen Bakugou go so crazy about anyone.
Just you. Over and over, just you. But now, especially.
You guys, Izuku said, his voice crumpling, thick tears rolling down his cheeks in hot trails. I love you guys. Ochako huffed with amusement, her eyes wet.
Us too. We're just so glad you're safe.
You gave us quite the scare, Ida said, his own eyes a little red. Once I find the heart, I'll give you a proper reprimanding. Izuku burst out a wet laugh, his chest aching, both the broken bone and his heart beneath.
You assholes making him cry already,
came a low drawl from the doorway. Izuku startled in the bed, wincing and squeezing Ochako's hand with the pain. Ochako held on firmly. His and Kachan's gaze locked from across the room, and Izuku's heart stirred to see the fatigue around his eyes, the dark circles that were likely of no note to anyone else. Hi, Izuku said quietly. How are your hands? Kachan scoffed with a cocky grin and leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, his arms folded loosely.
Fuck that. I'm not the one who ain't standing yet.
Izuku bit the inside of his cheek, studying Kachan's expression carefully. People commonly mistook Kachan for simple. He was, in fact, the opposite much of the time, and there was no way the story Izuku's friends had just shared lined up with the carefree way Kachan was addressing him. They were both smarter than to believe that. But there were people here, and Kachan obviously wasn't budging from the doorway. Could you guys give us a couple of minutes? Izuku asked with a brief smile.
Of course,
Ochako said, shooting Todoroki a stern look as Izuku caught him opening his mouth.
We'll visit again around dinner time.
Thanks. Izuku squeezed her hand one last time and released. Really? They said their goodbyes and slipped from the room, Kachan not moving from the doorway, only flattening himself against it a little to allow them to pass. Todoroki paused before Kachan for only a split second more, their stares holding before Todoroki continued forth. So, Izuku said, not sure where to look, so he stared at the get well cards at his bedside table. How are you really?
How the fuck do you think?
Kachan said, shutting the door behind him. He trudged into the room and slumped down into Todoroki's old seat, plucked a card at random and read it with narrowed eyes. With surprising delicacy, he set it back where it had stood. I don't know, Izuku said, still trying to read his face. Something about the energy in the room was all wrong. He'd expected yelling or affection, or mostly a combination of the two.
We're not together, Deku.
He'd known that. He really had. Between the two of them, there had barely been a word spoken of moving towards something more, whatever that might have meant for them. Izuku had spoken out of frustration and emotion and, more than anything else, hope. It wouldn't be the first or last time Katsuki Bakugou would shoot him down about something he desired. But there was also what Todoroki and Ochako had relayed to him. Where was that height of emotion now? What had banked such desperation? How was Kachan keeping so cool right now? I heard what happened, Izuku said, for lack of anything better.
You heard?
Kachan said, meeting Izuku's gaze with damp, red-rimmed eyes that had come on so suddenly Izuku sucked in a sharp breath.
You were there, stupid fucking Deku. You're the one who put his life on the line for my ass when I didn't fucking need it. What do you mean you heard?
I mean, I heard that you were upset. Kachan's eyes went large before he quickly looked away and coughed a harsh, raspy laugh, sniffled and wiped his nose on the back of his arm. Izuku locked in on the black gloves he wore, not his gift, but the compression gloves. They looked extremely tight. In fact, Kachan wasn't bending any of his fingers at all. When he'd picked up the card, it had been between two straight fingers, as if holding a cigarette.
Listen,
Kachan said, leaning back in the chair and crossing one ankle upon his knee. His hands laid uselessly at his lap, his gaze direct and hard as solid lava, revealing none of the molten turmoil inside.
I'm not here to sit around and reminisce over our romantic fucking getaway where you tried to kill yourself.
I would never try to.
We're not gonna do this shit anymore.
Izuku's mouth remained open from being interrupted. It didn't shut. His heart stuttered in his chest and dropped into his nauseous, rolling gut. What? He said, barely above a whisper. He couldn't tear his eyes from Kachan's face.
The fuck buddies thing was great and all, but...
Kachan's voice cracked on the last word and he cleared his throat, looking at a distant spot beside Izuku's shoulder rather than at him.
But you know there's a reason why heroes never... well...
No. Kachan rolled his eyes and uttered a gruff mix between a sigh and a frustrated growl. He dropped both feet to the floor, his elbows leaning upon his knees as he loomed in towards Izuku in the bed. This close, he could see how bloodshot his eyes were from, what, crying, when.
Okay, dumbass, riddle me this. You and me are going out or whatever. It's public. A villain strolls the fuck up knowing this about us. Who you think he's gonna go for first to compromise the battle? This is a simple fucking exam question here.
Numb, Izuku stared blankly at Kachan, his voice void of inflection. You, Izuku said. Me. They'd go for either of us.
Izuku,
Kachan said, his voice deep and warm, his face close and more serious than Izuku had ever seen it. Izuku's eyes widened, latched on Kachan's. His heart raced to hear his name on lips he'd kissed dozens of times. A thrill shot through his system. He could burst. Kachan?
I ain't gonna be the reason you die.
Agony, worse than any physical injury, splintered to his core, left him ripped, ragged in two, screaming inside. Frozen in pain, his vision blurring, tears dripping from his chin to his clenched fist, Izuku sat there in silence as Kachan stood. Hands cupped his cheeks, but they weren't cold and smooth, not Kachan's hands, not hot and urgent and calloused. Cool, distant. Warm lips pressed firmly to the top of his head and lingered. Izuku could only squeeze his eyes shut and gulp in a thick, sticky breath of panic, his cheeks soaked. Then he was left alone, barren, cold, as he heard slow footsteps head for the exit. Eyes screwed shut, his voice reedy with the tenuous grip he had on the sob building in his throat, Izuku spoke. You can't get rid of me, you know. And I still don't think you want to get rid of me.
There was a pause, a soft breath, and a hard swallow across the room. Izuku let himself fall apart when the door finally clicked shut.